Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really crucial piece of history for us. As fellow anarchists, it's absolutely vital we understand exactly how the Russian Revolution unfolded. We're going to impartially break down G.P. Maximov's historical analysis of Vladimir Lenin's strategic rise to power using excerpts from his book, The Guillotine at Work. Since Maximov was writing from a distinct anarcho-syndicalist perspective, his text offers this incredibly fascinating look at how libertarian socialists of the time actually viewed the Bolsheviks. We're going to explore how he argues the purest grassroots ideals of the working class were basically used as a stepping stone to absolute control. Okay, let's take a quick look at the agenda. We've got 5 parts. First, the historic paradox. Second, Lenin's pre-revolution promises. Third, the Marxist bait and switch. Fourth, rejecting the coalition. And finally, dictatorship and terror. Let's get into it. So Maximov opens his text by pointing out this huge, striking historical paradox. He asks, how exactly does a revolution that started off as relatively bloodless, driven by what he sees as the inherently humane and anti-authoritarian spirit of the Russian working class, how does that transform into a system of completely unrestrained state terror? It's a huge question, right? We're looking at this massive popular movement seeking genuine liberation from Tsarist autocracy. So how on earth does that very same decentralized movement end up building a highly centralized police state? That brings us to Section 1, the historic paradox, Russian socialism versus political Marxism. To really understand this monumental shift, Maximov argues we have to first look at the ideological battleground of that era. He starkly contrasts 2 vastly different visions of socialism. On one hand, you've got the decentralized traditions of Russian socialism. This was heavily influenced by the federalist, freedom-oriented philosophies of thinkers like Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, ideas that obviously resonate a lot with us. And this tradition made total sense to a peasant society that was already used to local, communal organizing. But on the other hand, he places political Marxism. Rooted in the Communist Manifesto, Maximov argues this ideology inherently demands absolute centralization and dictatorship. So for Marxism to actually take hold in Russia, it somehow had to overcome this deeply ingrained libertarian culture. Moving to Section 2, Lenin's pre-revolution promises, the propaganda of 1917. 1917 was this completely pivotal period where Lenin had to drastically adapt his message if he wanted to survive. According to the text, Lenin realized something absolutely crucial. Preaching the strict authoritarian centralization of the Communist Manifesto just was not going to fly in Russia at that moment. The masses were already out there taking action, setting up local councils on their own. So Maximov notes this fascinating tactical pivot. Lenin temporarily adopted the libertarian rhetoric found in Marx's pamphlet, The Civil War in France. Why? Because it aligned perfectly with the people's immediate demands for local control. Honestly, if he hadn't made this shift, Maximov suggests the Bolsheviks would have just remained a totally marginalized fringe faction. And just look at the promises he made. These were exactly what a decentralized socialist would want to hear. Lenin passionately promised all power to the Soviets, from the bottom up. He called for abolishing the police and the standing army in favor of universally arming the public. He demanded that officials be removable at literally any time by the voters and paid the same wages as an average skilled worker. He was essentially out there promising a fully developed, decentralized democracy where the state apparatus immediately begins to dismantle itself. Which leads us to Section 3, the Marxist bait and switch, from promises to reality. Now here's where things take a dark turn. Maximov fiercely argues that those earlier promises were basically an unprecedented, massive deceit. He maps out how Lenin systematically swapped out every single promise of freedom for centralized reaction the absolute second his power was secure. The bait was federalism, grassroots democracy, and local communes. The switch, which was rolled out almost immediately after the October upheaval, was extreme centralism, strict dictatorship, and a heavily centralized police state. Maximov asserts that the people had literally no reason to suspect this massive fraud while they were out in the streets cheering for a republic of Soviets. And to back this up, Maximov points to a highly revealing admission from 1922. Lenin openly confessed to party delegates that his early decrees were, in his exact words, a form of propaganda. He basically admitted that issuing all those decrees about worker control was just a tactical maneuver. He needed to test the waters and gain the, quote, enormous confidence of the ordinary worker and peasant. He recognized that pretending to champion their freedom was just a necessary phase to secure leadership before he could safely enact his true, centralized agenda. Wild, right? Okay, Section 4, rejecting the coalition, the intent for one-party rule. The really crucial point here is how this strategy of centralization manifested right after the October Revolution. This timeline shows just how rapidly the democratic process was tossed out the window. Just days after the seizure of power, the incredibly powerful Railway Workers' Union, VIKZL, demanded a broad coalition socialist government to prevent unrest. They even threatened a general strike. But on November 2nd, the Bolsheviks flat out rejected it. By November 17th, when the left social revolutionaries started asking why laws were completely bypassing the Central Executive Committee, Lenin just declared they had to brush aside various formalities. Boom, he was now effectively ruling by unilateral decree. Maximov suggests a deeply chilling motive here. By refusing to share power with moderate socialists and the left SRs, even when an alliance could have easily subdued reactionary forces, Lenin knowingly plunged the country into a devastating civil war. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would he want that? Well, Maximov argues that a civil war provided the perfect, chaotic environment to crush not just the old ruling class, but also independent anarchist groups and socialist democracy. It was the perfect excuse to guarantee an absolute totalitarian party dictatorship. Which brings us to our final section, dictatorship and terror, the final consolidation. This deliberate choice to fracture the Socialist Alliance paved the way for the Red Terror. The source uses Leon Trotsky's own recollections to show exactly where Lenin's head was at during this time. When Lenin found out his colleagues had briefly abolished the death penalty for soldiers, he was literally beside himself with fury. He called it inadmissible weakness and pacifist illusions. As Trotsky recalled, Lenin firmly believed that revolutionary success was physically impossible without executions and immediate drastic violence. Maximov emphasizes the second quote to show that Lenin viewed any hesitation toward extreme violence as a fatal flaw. He actively hammered the necessity of terror into his wavering colleagues. Whenever he heard what he dismissively called fine sentiments, or saw any reluctance to shoot saboteurs, he would furiously demand to know, where is the dictatorship? For Lenin, fully establishing the centralized state meant shedding all those utopian promises of 1917 and completely, totally embracing unrelenting, top-down coercion. So, where does that leave us? Maximov's analysis forces us to confront a pretty unsettling historical perspective. It suggests that the very language of liberation, decentralization, and human freedom was strategically weaponized to construct one of the most centralized, totalitarian states in history. It leaves us wondering, how easily can the purest promises of liberty become the ultimate bait and switch in the pursuit of absolute power? It's a vital lesson for our movements today. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked this fascinating history. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.